Hello, folks. Dustin Zarni here, Democratic Elections Commissioner for Onondaga County. Welcome to Commissioner Card. Today is Tuesday, March 3rd, and today I'll be talking about the SAVE Act. The SAVE Act is something that has been coming up quite a bit over the last month, really since the Republicans took over the Senate and House and presidency, making this piece of legislation a possible pass in this upcoming session of Congress. Though I want to put a pin in this because I am going to talk about whether this is likely to pass first. But before I go into this piece of legislation, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast is I've been getting a lot of calls at the Board of Elections about it. I've been getting a few messages on my social media accounts about it, and I've also participated in 2 to 3 different briefings over the last few months. One at the Partnership for Large Election Jurisdictions, one with Issue 1 and Brennan Center had 2 different briefings on this particular piece of legislation. And there's been a lot going on TikTok and a lot of fear out there about this piece of legislation. And I want to say right up front, the fear is real. If this piece of legislation were to pass the U.S. House, and I'll go into what it does in a second, it would be drastic and it would have huge consequences. That being said, I feel that the SAVE Act, which did pass the House last session, is unlikely to pass the U.S. Senate. It was not part of the fiscal budget outlook. It wasn't part of that package, so it can't be part of reconciliation, which means it would need 60 votes in the Senate. So I want to put that out there right away, that I feel like it is unlikely to pass. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't talk to your representatives about it. I can share with you that I have talked to Congressman Mannion and a couple of other congressmen in the New York delegation, Democratic congressmen in the New York delegation, and they've all assured me that they're voting against it. And Senator Schumer and Senator Gillibrand's office have put out statements or actions in the past that they are absolutely against this piece of legislation. So the New York representatives are solid, or at least the Democratic ones. Some of the Republican congressmen, Mike Lawler and Nick LaLota and Nick Johnson and Claudia Tenney and Elise Stefanik for now, they have all said that they're voting for it or have voted for it in the past. So there is still, if you live in those areas, there's still calls to make. But I do feel like it is unlikely to pass the Senate and most likely not to become law anytime soon. That doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about the legislation. And that's why I decided to do a podcast episode on it, because it is a phenomenally badly crafted piece of legislation. And in fact, when I was in Albany on February 4th, I was asked directly by Republican members of the New York legislature about the SAVE Act. Now, it's very doubtful that the SAVE Act is going to pass in New York on its own, especially if it's not going to pass on the federal level. But this is a talking point for Republicans. So I want to break down why the SAVE Act is just a really bad piece of legislation. It's just badly crafted. But let's talk about what it purports to do. What it's supposed to do and what it's trying to do is make in federal elections, not only federal elections, now they don't have any power over state and local elections, the federal government, but they do have power over the federal government. And they're trying to make in federal elections to have to provide proof of citizenship to register to vote or change your registration to vote. And so What does that mean? And that means either a real ID, a birth certificate, or passport. These are all things that indicate whether you're a citizen or not. And they want that documentation to be provided when you first register to vote and when you change your registration to vote. But they go beyond just providing that proof. That's bad enough, by the way, and I'll go into the statistics about why that's bad and what that would do in a second. But they say that it has to be in person, that the providing of the proof has to be in person at the counter at boards of elections across the nation. So people, 90% or a ton of people register by mail. It's been, in my county, in Onondaga County, New York, about 90% of them register to vote through either the DMV or the new online voter registration system. That's where most of our registrations come in. But what the SAVE Act would do is say that those registrations are not valid for federal elections unless they provide this proof of citizenship. And not only does it, and that they have to provide it in person. They can't mail in a copy. There's no other way. There's no electronic upload that can happen or anything like that. They have to provide this paperwork in person at the voter registration offices. So even if you register online, you have to find some time before you go to vote to show up with this piece of paperwork and check it in. Now, this legislation, if enacted, would go into effect immediately and would have no funding from the federal government. And in fact, the legislation is very clear that all of the costs for implementing these new rules would be borne by the states and the local boards of elections offices. And, that means the cost of getting systems that will handle these different types of registrations and more people at counters to be able to provide avenues for people to turn in this paperwork that they're saying they're going to require. But again, it's not just first-time voters this is going to affect. It also affects, they say, any registration event. So it also would affect voters who are updating their address, updating their political party. Anything that you fill out a voter registration form for that would change your voter registration, you would have to provide this proof of citizenry. This would affect current voters as well. So if you're a current voter and you're registered, it's likely that if you never change your address or you change your political party, you probably are going to be fine. But again, it's not that clear in the legislation that you're fine. But once you change your address, once you decide you want to change your political party, then you have to provide this proof of citizenship to be able to vote in a federal election. Again, state and local elections, they cannot affect with the SAVE Act. This is only federal elections, so your elections for congressman, senate, and president. So, why is this so problematic? Well, let me throw some stats at you. And before I do, I want to give a shout out to my friends at the Brennan Center and Issue 1 who provided some of these stats to me in some of these briefings. And so I may be looking down to read off something. It's only because I want to make sure I get this correct. So roughly 64% of respondents in a study that was done back in the 2020 election. Now, the 2024 election just happened, but in the 2020 election, roughly 64% of respondents who lack easy access to citizenship documents are registered to vote. So if these are 64% of the people who are registered to vote who have said they don't have this easy access to provide these documents that the SAVE Act is requiring. And 60% reported that they voted in the 2020 election. So about 12 million Americans who cast a ballot in 2020 would be functionally unable to register to vote if the SAVE Act were passed. That's about 12%. And remember, you may think, oh, this just only affects people who move. Well, 12% of America move every year. So that's a significant amount of voters that are going to be affected by this. And people, register to vote all the time. 91 million citizens either registered for the first time or updated their registration in the 2 years leading up to the 2020 election. Nearly 70 million in the 2 years leading up to the 2022 election. So all of these people would have to provide this documentation if the SAVE Act were passed, and have to provide it in person. And in fact, so that would, that again would cause a great deal more work for local boards of elections. 37 million people who are registered for the first time or updated their registration using mail, online, or voter registration drives in the 2 years before the 2020 election. So that means that they're not registering at a Board of Elections office where they can put in this paperwork. They're doing it online. They're doing it by mail. They're at a voter registration drive. And thus would then have to make a separate appointment to go to a Board of Elections to provide that paperwork. Another 17 million did so in the 2 years ending in the 2022 midterms. So in the 2 years leading up to that. So again, this isn't just a presidential year issue. It's a off-year issue either, because millions upon millions of people register and update their registration all the time. So in mail, online, or registration drives accounted for about 1 in 3 registrations over that 4-year period. So a third of the electorate did either mail, online, or registration drives where they weren't at the Board of Elections and they would have to provide these documents a second time to the Board of Elections. So why is it so hard to provide that documentation? Why am I making such a big deal about this? It's because the legislation is very unclear in certain ways for voters to be able to vote who don't have ready access to that registration. While it doesn't prohibit voters from mailing in their applications or presumably registering online, the registration would not be complete until they appear in person with their documentation. And though they make accommodations for ADA, it doesn't say what those accommodations are. They say that there's going to be an affidavit process, but it doesn't define what that affidavit process is or who would be allowed to complete these affidavits for these registrations or be able to vote in federal elections if they didn't provide this registration. So, what is proof? What is considered proof in the SAVE Act documentation? Well, a form of ID issued consistent with the Real ID Act that indicates the applicant is a citizen, a valid U.S. passport, applicant's official military ID card, together with a military record of service showing place of birth within the U.S. And so not the ID card itself is not enough. You have to have this record of service. A valid government ID card issued by a federal, state, or tribal government showing that the applicant's place of birth was in the U.S. Please pay attention to that, because that's very important. That all of these details have to implicitly say that the place of birth was in the U.S. Or a valid government-issued photo ID, which includes a certified birth certificate, including the full name of the applicant, an extract from a U.S. hospital record of birth, adopted decree showing place of birth, a consular report of birth abroad as a U.S. citizen, naturalization certificate, or American Indian card with KIC classification. So the first type of valid citizenship, the Real ID, is murky. It's misleading because Real IDs are issued to permanent residents. Real IDs are actually issued to non-citizens. So it can't. They won't just accept any real ID. Idaho real IDs, for example, are issued in the past 2 years. May be an exception. They may have the citizenship listed on them, but Ohio's real ID indicates if someone is not a citizen. So it doesn't, for citizens that are citizens, it doesn't say they're a citizen, but for Ohio residents that are not a citizen, it indicates that on the real ID. Enhanced driver's license, like I have for New York, are issued to U.S. citizens, but do not say anything indicating citizenship on the physical card. And again, the legislation says the ID has to say they're a citizen on it. So this would require states that use real ID to be able to change. They'd have to change their real ID to make it sure that it says explicitly that you're a citizen on there. U.S. passport must be valid. Expired passports aren't acceptable. And the procedures for voters who've had name changes, do not have a passport, are completely unclear. So this is what has gone on TikTok and has gotten a lot of you to contact me, is that there's been a lot of stuff out there about women who change their name because they're married, but their birth certificate has their original name on it. So even if they have access to the document, it doesn't have their full name on there. So how is that going to be accepted? The legislation doesn't cover that. It doesn't tell you how you will bridge that gap between somebody who has changed their name and somebody in their original birth certificate. And again, this has nothing to do with trans identity or anything like that, although that would be a clear problem as well. We're talking about married women who have changed, or men who have changed their name, either hyphenated or into a whole different last name when they got married. This would be a barrier to them to be able to register to vote. And though the legislation says that there could be things put in place, it doesn't say what that is. There's supposed to be a voter attestation or an EO affidavit as alternative proof, but it doesn't define what that alternative proof is and what that attestation is. It just leaves it up to those interpreting the law. And I can tell you, you'll probably have 50 different states interpreting it in 50 different ways, and thus open the litigation from bad actors that just want to throw people out. Now, let alone whether we were able to solve all of the issues that I just outlined, the complexity would be, it will have a huge cost burden. It doesn't say what that cost burden is, but it does say that the cost burden is borne by the localities. So New York would have to pay to upgrade our systems to be able to participate in the federal elections, to be able to accommodate this, and it would be borne by New York taxpayers. There is no federal money assigned to this bill. So that, I always hear, when I go to Albany, that, it's so ridiculous that we're spending all this money to empower voters, early voting by mail, that we're spending all this money to empower voters, and that it's unfunded mandate, they always say. Well, this would be an unfunded mandate, but it would be to keep people from being able to register to vote, to hinder voters, not make it easier, make it harder. And it's really unsure about why they want to put, I can understand, although disagree with them doing it for first-time voters, people who are registering for the first time. But this has things for changing voters. So if somebody changes their address or changes their political party and has the registration event, they have to provide this citizenship again, even if they already provided it the first time. Well, citizenship is very rarely revoked. It can't really be revoked outside of major issues. I think treason, I think is one of them, or something like that, or a naturalized citizen that they could revoke their nationalization. It was so very rare. So why, if you already provided the citizenship the first time, which would be costly and burdensome to even first-time voters, but why do you have to do it again? And it seems to me that that's because the point of the legislation isn't necessarily to ensure that non-citizens aren't voting. It's to make sure that they can find ways to keep certain segments from voting. That's what it seems like to me. It also says that states have to have back-end systems designed and implemented within 30 days of the bill being passed. I can tell you, look, we're doing automatic voter registration in New York. That's a back-end system. It's taken us 5 years to develop that. Now, is that too long? Absolutely, it's too long. But there's no way we could do it within 30 days. That would be really problematic. The other problematic thing is, it is quite likely that many state governments are not going to require SAVE Act type of state laws for their state and local elections, which would create a bifurcated voting system. We actually already see this in reverse in Arizona. Arizona has a citizenship requirement for their local elections, but because state law or federal law does not allow that, the federal elections, they actually have to have a more permissive system. So they already have a bifurcated list for people who provided that citizenship. They're allowed to vote in local elections along with the federal elections, and then another list for people who can only vote in federal elections. That means not only do you have to have two different lists, and you have to update your voter record, say what a voter is allowed to do, but you have to have two different styles of ballot for every election district, every language, all of that. So it would double the cost of any election on the federal level, because you would have these bifurcated lists. And I can guarantee you in New York, because our Constitution and other things would not allow certain things like this on the state and local level, that we would have that bifurcated. It would double the cost. Now, I said earlier, it's going to affect certain populations more than other. Well, only more than 9% of American voting age citizens, 21.3 million people, don't have a passport, birth certificate, or naturalization papers readily available, according to the statistics given by the Brennan Center. And only about half of Americans actually have a passport, the one document that is guaranteed to allow you to register to vote. So this has a greater impact on the voters of color, 11% of whom lacked access to citizenship documents as compared to 8% of white Americans. Younger voters who do not have this citizenship, any form of voter ID has been shown that it really hurts younger voters. And then, of course, voters who change their name. 79% of married women change their name. So this is something that affects people of color, females who change their name, or married females, and and then, of course, younger voters. All segments of populations that are already have lower participation when it comes to voter participation. So, and let's be frank, people of color, women, younger voters tend to vote more liberal, more Democratic. And this is a Republican Congress that is trying to pass it under a Republican president. They don't see any problems with this, mainly because I don't think it's their people that they believe will be impacted. Although people who are of lower social economic class are going to have problems here too, because if they don't have this paperwork, it's going to cost them to get it. And it's a cost that is not something that is usually in the budget of those living on minimum wage or poverty wages as well. It's not something that they're going to prioritize in their life to be able to get. And remember, it's not a privilege to vote. It's a right to vote. If you're a U.S. citizen, you have that right to vote. And if you're born here, you are a U.S. citizen. And this is also, this move with the SAVE Act is actually, coming with the whole move on birthright citizenship and other things. So it is a extremely problematic piece of legislation that doubles the cost of election administration, and only will serve to hinder voters, especially at-risk voters, from being able to participate. But here's the kicker, and one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast is right now the burden is on the voter to know that they are that they're registered to vote, that they have a proper that they can register to vote, that they are a citizen. That is all burden is on the voter. And if someone lies to register to vote that's not a citizen, I'm not going to say it doesn't happen. It does happen. It happens in incredibly minuscule amounts. Nothing that would actually switch an election. But it does happen where people do commit voter fraud. And they do commit registration fraud. But when that happens, it's the burden is on the registered voter. This legislation would purse that burden on the boards of elections, on the election administration officials. In fact, if I were to register someone to vote that did not have a right to vote, I could face a 5-year penalty in jail and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. And you may say, oh, well, just don't do it wrong then. Well, I pointed out all of these legislative hurdles and also burdens that would be bare. And as you know, the burden on our current registration system is even higher than what it was, in 5 years ago. And not every county has funded that in the appropriate way. So, just say that, oh, well, we'll just get these magical resources and be able to use them, and that there would never be somebody who slips through the crack and gets registered to vote. And then putting that burden on the election official and not on the voter will drive an already huge increasing resignation rate through the roof for election administration officials across the country. As caucus chair in New York, I can tell you that we've had tons of resignations and tons of turnover just from the added workload that we have now. And this would double, triple the added workload that we have, and then put a burden on us that our liberty and our financial, we could have a financial penalty against us if someone were to register to vote and slip through the cracks, despite our best efforts. So this is we already have this huge problem with election officials resigning across the country because of the added burden and stress of the job. This will send it through the roof. So the act costs more, only will result in less people being able to register to vote, does not solve a problem that is reticent in American elections. We do not have large amounts of non-citizens voting. It would actually hurt our electoral system because more people would be kept from voting, which would actually decrease the confidence in our electoral system, and then cause election administration officials to have even a bigger crosshair on them. It's a bad piece of legislation. It's badly written. It's hastily written. It's it does not provide all the avenues that it says it provides. It doesn't flesh that out, and it probably is more of a messaging bill than an actual bill. But it will pass the House, probably. I know that the House Republican majority is only a couple of votes, but as you saw with the budget negotiations this last time around, they find a way to get everybody to vote for their stuff. And this piece of legislation was put into the rules package. And the rules package means that it doesn't have to go to committee. It can bypass committee and go right to the floor of the House. Many people expect that it will pass the House in the next couple weeks or so. But it has an unclear future in the Senate. Because it wasn't put into the budget resolution, and because it wasn't part of the framework, It's probably can't be put into reconciliation. I always say probably because I never know. Weird things happen up at the Senate, up at the House. But it probably cannot be put in reconciliation. Reconciliation is a way to bypass the 60-vote filibuster in the Senate. The one caveat I give to people who think, oh, well, it's dead, so why are we talking about it? Well, the Senate could change its filibuster rules with, I believe, just a straight majority vote. You may not need a 60-vote vote to change the filibuster. I don't think they'd ever get rid of the filibuster. Senator Tom Tillis, who's the leader, and Senator Mitch McConnell, who used to be the leader of the Senate, Republicans have said that they're not going to get rid of the filibuster. They've said it recently. I don't think they'll get rid of it. But there could be tremendous pressure to alter the filibuster. By the way, the Democrats wanted to alter the filibuster to increase voting rights. In the last Congress, they didn't end up having the votes for it. And all the Republicans voted against that. You would imagine that some of those Republicans would vote against it and all the Democrats would vote against it this time around to decrease voting rights. But that's where we're unsure. So how can you help? Well, if you live in the 22nd Congressional District, Congressman John Mannion has already said he's not going to vote for this. I wouldn't really spend a lot of time calling there. That's a lot. Senator Gillibrand, Senator Schumer, they have already said that they're not going to vote for it. However, if you have friends in other states with Republican senators, if you have friends in other states with more conservative senators like Pennsylvania's John Fetterman, for example, then perhaps you could call your friends and have them call their representatives. If you had friends that lived in Republican congressmen's, or maybe you're watching this and you're in a Republican congressman's district. We have a few in upstate New York. Mike Lawler, Elise Stefanik, Claudia Tenney, Nick Johnson, Nick LaLota. These are all Republicans in New York, and Nicole Malatakis on Staten Island. These are all times having your friends who live in those districts call. It's not very effective for you to call if you don't live in those districts. You can. It's a free country. But it's more effective to hear from their own constituents. I've talked to Josh Riley. I've talked to John Mannion. Those are people that I know that are congressmen. They've both indicated to me, and I have no reason to believe that they are firm no's on this. And I think you'll see a firm no from every House Democrat on this. Hakeem Jeffries has been very clear about this. So is Senator Schumer. I think you're not going to see many Democratic votes, if any, on this piece of legislation. What you do want to make sure of is that there's less Republican votes. And so talking to people in those districts who can then talk to their representatives, or in those states who can then talk to those representatives, that's what you can do. And that's really the only thing you can do. And you can be vigilant. You can watch for this, and you can share this podcast. I don't often say that. You should if you want to. But I wanted to spend some time and go a little bit away from what I usually do with Commissioner in the car to talk about this issue, because I've been getting a lot of calls at the board. I've tried to answer as much as I can, but at the board, when I'm working for the county, when I'm working as commissioner, I didn't really get into my opinions about this, because that's what I do on this podcast. This is what I do on my own time, in my own car, with my own phone, and my own social medias. So I do hope that you will, I hope this was informative. If this piece of legislation passes, it would be catastrophic for voting rights. But the likelihood of it passing is very small, but not zero. So when weighing what the catastrophic results would be versus the slight possibility of it passing, it's worth being concerned. It is not worth being concerned over other issues. And in many ways, this is kind of a distraction. I think a lot of people have said it's a little bit of a distraction because it won't pass the Senate. And we see the attacks on federal workers, which is real. The attacks on our budget, which is real. The attacks on Medicare and Social Security, which is real. The efficiency of government, and the problems that is being had by all these mass firings, which is real. These are things that are very real and more important than this issue. But I'm a voting rights advocate, so I'm going to talk about it. And I wanted to let you guys know that I heard about it. I've done some research on it, and now I'm ready to talk about it. And I hope that you found this somewhat fulfilling about why it's a problem, what are the problems with it, and how it can be prevented. So thank you very much. Next week, what I do this last week, I did a weekly wonk, finally wrapping up the 2024 general election. It's on my website, dustinzarny.com. There's some interesting stuff there about how many people voted on election day versus overall turnout. Check it out. And also I did some really nice graphics, I think, of how voting has happened throughout the county. I also appeared on Inspiration for the Nation with George Kirkpatrick yesterday, which I didn't get up yet. So I'm going to see if I can get that up on my Facebook feeds sometime later today or tomorrow. And then finally, I will be doing another commissioner. I'll be doing another weekly wonk this week. I'll be looking at Onondaga County, our first look at Onondaga County as a whole. Even though we don't have any countywide races this year so far, it's always a possibility that somebody could resign or pass away over the next year that would cause an election. But right now, no. But we're going to start off with looking at Onondaga County and seeing where we are, and then we'll go into the towns and the city as we get ready for the City of Syracuse primary later this summer, and then looking at county legislature and towns that are having races going into the fall throughout the year. So we're into the political subdivision weekly wonks, and hopefully I'll keep up the weekly strategy. Next week's Commissioner in the Car, we'll be talking village elections. In fact, that'll be our topic the next 2 weeks, because there are village elections on Tuesday, March 18th in Fabius, Jordan, Skaneateles, and Manlius, although only Skaneateles and Manlius are run by the Board of Elections, so we'll talk about that. I'm actually going to Albany these next 2 Tuesdays to tomorrow and the next week to talk and try to get money for local boards of elections. That's something I do with my own expense, but it is something I do a few times a year, just because I think it's important to have the legislators hear from local elected officials. And so that's going on the next 2 Tuesdays, but I'm in the office otherwise. So thank you very much. And remember, go to dustinzarny.com to like and subscribe. And you can share this podcast as well if you found it interesting. Bye-bye.